In the world of medicine, where every decision can change lives, your peace of mind is crucial. This is where Pattern steps in. Imagine insurance made simple, fast, and personalized, just for you. With Pattern, you're not just getting disability and life insurance, you're insuring your future and protecting your greatest asset, your income. In the past 10 years, Pattern has transformed the way over 20,000 doctors secure their financial well-being. Discover the simplicity of securing your future at patternlife.com or click the link in the description. You know that Instagram meme, protect this man at all costs? Well, that applies to today's guest. He's a gifted writer whose Twitter threads helped MedTwitter grapple with life and loss, particularly during the darkest times of the pandemic. I'm so lucky to have him as a guest today. Have a listen. Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. Welcome back to the podcast. We have a super special guest today, and this is one of the situations where it's like long-time listener, first-time caller, but it's the other way around because I've been following his writings on Twitter for a long time. And so I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Syed Tabatabai. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, that was actually really, really good. I'm impressed.
Thank you. So it's a low bar to impress, but I'll take it. So he's a nephrologist in San Antonio and the author of the new book, These Vital Signs, A Doctor's Notes on Life and Loss in Tweets. In his spare time, he loves to travel, play guitar, and play the role of Darth Vader for the Star Wars Society of San Antonio for various charitable causes, which is going to totally endear him to you even more. You can find him on Twitter at @TheRealDrT, and his writings have been featured before this book, have been featured in Physicians Weekly, The Wall Street Journal, the San Antonio Express News, and NPR. And I strongly recommend you get out and read These Vital Signs. I got it myself on Audible. It's a poignant series of essays inspired by his medical experience and based on a series of poems that he posted on Twitter. And so we're going to be talking today about the book, his inspiration, and how we might learn something from his writings that can help us be better clinicians, better physicians. So once again, Dr. Tabatabai, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Well, you're most welcome, and thank you for appearing. My first question is, before you finished medical school, was your Twitter handle, because it's currently The Real Dr. T. So before, were you at The Real Mr. T?
Yeah, before I graduated med school, that's when the change happened. No, I've been The Real Dr. T throughout. Actually, I get called Mr. T by patients not infrequently, and I always joke about the jewelry and the hairstyle. That's kind of the thing. But no, it's been The Real Dr. T for a while.
Don't miss your dialysis, sucker.
Yeah, I pity the fool.
That's it's a funny thing that happens to me too, is they're like trying to be more formal, right? So they call you Mr. instead of Doctor. And, to be offended by that would be ludicrous, but I just think it's really interesting that happens. They're like searching for a way to address you in a formal way. And that's what it comes out as, which is, I ultimately take it as a sign of respect for the relationship.
Yeah, it's a nice icebreaker. It usually gets a chuckle.
So, okay. So first of all, why Twitter?
Great question. It's a kind of a long and circuitous story, but really, I made a Twitter handle way back in the day when I was first kind of dipping my toes in social media with Facebook and, the precursor MySpace. And even before that, there was a blogging site that doesn't exist anymore called Mindsay, where I used to post little blogs and essays and whatnot. But Twitter initially didn't hold much appeal for me. It just seemed like it was very kind of rapid fire and very sort of bite-sized, and I wasn't that interested in it. But years later, we had a consultant come by through our private practice, and one of the things they mentioned was you need to grow your social media presence because sometimes patients find you through there, and it's a way to connect with people and educational stuff. And so I went back to my dormant Twitter account, and I started posting kind of nephrology tweets, quote unquote. And I got very little traction and very little engagement. I had 6 followers when I started, and 3 were my family, and I don't know who the other 3 were. And then after about a year of doing nephrology tweets, I had like 5 followers. And so I was like, this is going nowhere. So at that point, I realized that you could actually link tweets together. And so then it became intriguing because I was like, well, hey, you could actually write something longer with this. And the actual character limit for me sort of became like a game. Like, how can I say what I want to say in as few words as possible, pick the right words? And I think it actually made me a better writer because I was able to condense what I wanted to say. And then I started to really enjoy that medium. And that's where the book came from, is I started to write threads. And that's when I got traction. And that was through Twitter. And people like Mark Shapiro and other people Twitter is actually really good at amplifying and spreading the word and having people connect. And then it just took off from there.
Has it changed since Twitter was taken over by, effectively a Bond villain?
Boy, has it changed. I think it's definitely changed. But if you ask me what that change is, there's some obvious things. Like, obviously now it feels like the bots are out of control. It feels like there's a lot of automated garbage and you have to wade through. But the actual feel of Twitter feels different. It doesn't feel as organic and connected as it used to. It feels a lot more isolated and siloed. And, there are people I follow, and for whatever reason, I'll go like a week plus without seeing a single tweet from them, even though they're tweeting. It just feels like we're sort of spread out more, like the community isn't cohesive.
It's like the algorithm isn't working. I remember when I would be more active I'm barely active on it now. Truth be told, I would tweet and then delete it. So I wouldn't actually send it out to anybody. I would just get afraid and then delete it. But I would follow and I would read a lot and it would draw me in and, it would have the hold on me that it's supposed to, just doesn't have the hold. But how has it changed your relationship? Because you've found your voice on this medium. And so how has your relationship with it changed?
I think what things were in the early days when I was connecting with the audience in kind of a big way and getting a lot of feedback. And, let's be honest, when you write on Twitter, there's a lot of dopamine hits involved with that, getting likes, the whole social media thing. That was really attractive for me, and getting, watching your follower count and all that kind of stuff. But honestly, I don't really care about that stuff anymore. It doesn't really matter to me at this point. I write for the joy of it. Feels honestly a little bit, even though the experience itself is not as much, I guess it's not as quite as fulfilling as it used to be. In a way, it feels almost a little more healthy in terms of how I write now, because I don't feel pressure to create content. That was one of the earlier things. I was always like, I got to come up with another thread. I got to think about stuff. Now, if it strikes me, I'll write. If I'm inspired. I'm actually working on a book that's not Twitter. It's just a conventional novel. It's actually inspired by one of my Twitter stories. So a lot of my writing is now not happening on Twitter anymore. But I'm kind of like you. I'm more just kind of listening now and sort of, reposting stuff and stuff like that. But that's kind of which way things have headed. I've sort of peeled away a little bit from the Twitter writing.
That's interesting. You've outgrown it. It had its role in your life and in your development, and it still has its place, but it's not as central because you've kind of grown beyond it.
Yeah, I think I don't think I'll ever outgrow it completely. I think it's always going to have a special place in my heart. I think a big part for me, and I think this is true for everybody, whether it's writing, whether it's medicine, whether it's, sports or art or whatever, when we sort of dip our toes into a venue where there's public, I guess, view or appreciation or whatever, there's a strong sense of imposter syndrome. In medicine, it's very well honed. I think it's a rite of passage. I think that this was helpful for me in a big way to let me just know that I could write stuff that would resonate with people. And I never felt like ever posting anything because I always felt like it was, just subpar or just not interesting to anybody else. And so that aspect of it, Twitter has been huge for me to find that there was an audience out there, that I do have a voice that people want to, interact with. And also the responses I've gotten, the way, especially during things like COVID or responses from trainees when I try and post encouraging stuff like it's going to get better, this kind of stuff. It's really fulfilling, and I'm really grateful for that. In the end, my book doesn't exist anymore or Twitter doesn't exist anymore. It'll still have all been worth it to me for the kind responses and connections I've formed through my writing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the audience should hear, because I told you before the show that he is responsible for me crying on the toilet many a time because, that's my private scrolling time. This is where I escape my family. All those, Instagram memes that my wife sends me about husbands spending too much time on the toilet. That's me. And so that's where I did my scrolling. And that's where I would read his tweets and his stories. And they're really poignant. Like, they're really poignant. It shows this depth of understanding of the experience. I mean, and the experience, and a lot of it was around COVID. You were in San Antonio, you were in the ICU, you're a nephrologist, but you did some intensive care, and it was really hard stuff to grapple with. And so, but the way that you were able to put it into words and make it available for our patients to be able to see, for our patients to be able to see what we go through. Now, I'm an ear, nose, throat doctor in private practice. So even though New York was like at the epicenter at some point, I was on call for the hospital, and normally I have to see many patients a week. I saw zero because it was just all COVID all the time. There wasn't any role for me. So it was second line, it wasn't front line, maybe third line, but still, like, this was an awful time. And just the value that God, it sounds like a finance value added, the value that gave to the experience and community. It was just incredible. And I thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I think that whole period of time, that's really, I think, when my writing sort of exploded during that time. I think I went into overdrive during COVID, because at that point, the writing flipped for me from being just purely a fun thing to being like therapy. It became like a lifeline. It also was sort of, I wanted to have almost like a historical record because it was so surreal.
Yeah.
I was trying to describe it to people who aren't in medicine. And like, how do you describe it? How do you tell people that, okay, now we're taking over the pediatric ICU. We're taking over HR offices and converting into makeshift ICU because we have no space to put these people. Like, it felt like being in a tidal wave. And I was trying to convey that. And it was hard because there were two distinct experiences with COVID, right? You had the people who were seeing it up close and personal. You had the people who were experiencing it as patients and through family members. And then there were people who were relatively unscathed, where the problem was not so much the COVID, it was kind of the societal shutdown and all the other things that came with it. And they were kind of like, so what's really going on? And so I was trying to kind of pull the veil back on that and sort of show what it was like. But yeah, now, it feels weird sometimes because COVID was not that long ago, but sometimes it feels like, that was a different lifetime. So, and we still have COVID. It's not like it's gone, but.
No, but I just saw a report came out, hospitalizations are so down, like hospitalizations are at the lowest point since the start of the pandemic or something like that. Like, it's gotten to the point where it's still contagious. It's still out there. It's still happening, but we're not living anywhere near like we were then. Right. And like the new normal is now the new normal. You can go somewhere and wear masks. Right. You can ask someone to I'm in New York. You can ask someone to put a mask on. I'm not sure in San Antonio you can ask, but like, we had patients sometimes do that. And it's like, okay. Whereas pre-COVID, that never would have been like, what? You want me to what? Yeah, I actually didn't even realize the emotional experience that I was having until, I had at the start, at shutdown, we had a 4-month-old, a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old. And, we had them close together because we were expecting to have help and no help, right? Because nobody was going anywhere. But the 2 older ones went to summer camp that summer. And my wife showed me a picture because first day of summer camp, I was like 2, actually, but at that point they were 2.5 and 4, saw each other from across the field and ran to each other and hugged. And my wife showed me a picture and I burst out into tears. And I couldn't understand why. I didn't know, but like reading your writing helps me kind of understand that emotional toil. So yeah, it was really, it's surreal, and thank God it's over. And hopefully we've learned something for the next one, but I think some people have, and hopefully we'll be equipped to deal with the ones that haven't. Leading a medical practice is challenging. There can be reimbursement changes, referral slowdowns, staff turnover, or drama. There are obstacles in the way of achieving your goals, or maybe it feels like you've hit a plateau. Who can you turn to for help with the business of managing a medical practice? The Physician Growth Accelerator, a private practice partner that helps you uncover and overcome constraints in your practice. They will check your business vitals, identify the root cause of what's restricting your growth, prescribe what to do about it, and help you achieve it, just like we do with our patients. Imagine a practice, imagine your practice, where stress is reduced, profits increase in both patients and staff, and you are happier. They've been making that vision a reality for over a decade. Isn't it time your practice thrived? Discover how at physiciangrowthaccelerator.com.
It's an experience, obviously, that nothing really could have prepared us for it in terms of what we went through. And that thing you're describing, that vague feeling you can't quite put a finger on, and then out of the blue, it'll hit you like a ton of bricks. It's really grief in a way. It's a way we grieve. And that's part of the stories, too, is how do you put that into words and that feeling?
Well, storytelling is an important part of medicine, right? Whether we're talking to family members, or we're talking to a patient, or we're trying to persuade someone of something, right? Like, here are the statistics behind the vaccine. This is why you should get it, right? Nobody's going to be convinced by that unless they're already on board with it. But sometimes a story can help move somebody. And not by telling them you should do this, but let me tell you a story, right? So you don't have many characters on Twitter, and we don't have much time in each patient encounter. So do you have any tips for telling a good story in a limited amount of time?
Well, I think stories are at the heart of medicine for me. Obviously, this is not true for every single medical specialty, but for the most part, every patient essentially presents with a story, right? It's like, once upon a time, I was okay, and this happened. And then part of the skill of being a physician, part of medicine, is learning to pick up on the story, realize you're being told a story, listen to the story really well. I think that's where it starts, is you have to be able to listen to the patient. And when you hear where they're coming from and you're able to listen to them and kind of get their experience through the story, hear what they've been through, then you can communicate to them kind of in their language and their terms. And as far as telling patient stories, I don't know that I kind of explicitly do that so much as I try and cultivate that empathy and that connection, whether it's through some sort of, shared experience or some sort of, we always have connections with our patients in some way. I mean, at the very basic level, our humanity, being able to tell them, okay, here's the data, but, I care about you. I care about what's going to happen to you. And this is sort of the way it goes, and sort of telling people a narrative. Stories take our interest and hold them, in a way that data and other stuff doesn't really do. And the stories also provide us with a way to put things in context and synthesize that. I don't know that I have any shortcuts, to be honest with you. I think it's just something that over time, we all do, even if we don't put terms to it. We all learn how to tell stories. We all learn how to communicate, and we get better with it over time. But if I had one piece of advice, I would say that to be a good storyteller, you have to be a good listener. Because without being able to listen to people, you're not going to be able to get the depth and breadth of knowledge of human experience and the experiences people go through to be able to relate to them.
And I would argue that being a good listener necessitates that you help them tell their story.
Right.
Because patients often struggle with it. And we always get told, well, don't interrupt your patient. And I would push back on that and say, they struggle to tell their stories. And I can't help them tell their story without interrupting them sometimes. Like, I'm not doing it to tell them that I know better. I'm telling them, here, listen, there's, you seem to be kind of stuck on the same part of your story. How do we get to the next part of your story?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that every now and then, when people are sort of getting lost in the weeds a little bit, it's helpful to let them know that you're listening and that you sort of want to hear more of the story or hear kind of the big picture. I think that's fine.
One of the things that I picked up from one of your stories that you tell in your book about when you were a medical student and you were following a surgeon is that surgeon noticed that the patient had like a dog bone or something dog on their keychain. So then the surgeon asked him about his dog. And what that did is it let the patient know that the surgeon recognized that he was a human being and more than just an amalgamation of his symptoms. And I thought that was really methodical and clever and important.
The things that make us feel like we're being heard are usually small things. It's almost always a small detail or some little thing that where you say, oh, wow, that person really paid attention to me, or they really saw me as a human being. One of the things I learned, and a lot of docs do this, isn't unique for me by any means, is that when I do clinic notes, the first line of my note is always some little detail about the patient. Let's say 56-year-old gentleman who owns a dance studio.
Yeah.
Or, something like that. And
plays
then
jazz flute. Yeah.
There you go. Or has a cat named Napoleon or something like that. And then the moment you sit down with them, the first thing I'm not going to be like, hey, how are you peeing? That kind of thing. It's like you connect with them on something else other than medicine. And it's sort of acknowledging them, hey, I know you're a person. You're someone outside of this room. How are things going? How's life? And then you get that little connection. Yeah. And they're like, wow, you see so many patients and you remember my cat or you remember this.
What do you tell them? Do you tell them that it's in your notes, or do you just like let that go?
It depends. Most of the time I'll be like, yeah, I wrote it down. My memory's not perfect, but yeah, I'll be like, I put these little details in my notes, and they can access my notes too. So
they'll see it.
Yeah, they'll see it there.
Yeah, I always look at my assessment and plan from the previous visit. So I always write something like, and have fun in Florida, or something like that, because they leave with it. And then that's my clue to ask them about it next time, something like that. I mean, it's very non-specific because this is Long Island and everyone goes to Florida. So, but you could say that on like 50%.
Yeah, for me, it's how is the cruise you went on?
Yeah,
a lot of people going on cruises.
Yeah, cruise ships that leave. Sure, that makes sense. So you said it's important for to find the humanity in the patient. And I thought something else that I picked up on from more than one of your stories was that if patients are, particularly if they're in an ICU bed, but I think in any hospital room, particularly if they are not responsive or not, in control of all their faculties, putting pictures of them in their room from throughout their life. You're not like giving advice in your book, but it still comes through. And I really like what comes from that is that it really humanizes this person who's basically, intubated, trached, pegged on 3 pressors. And I mean, I'm an outpatient ENT doctor, so I don't remember all the other stuff that happens in the ICU. But, they've got all these monitors on them, and they're really just, a series of numbers, unless. And then, you had mentioned that these patients have pictures of them on their wall. And I think that's great advice to give to patients, especially if you're their doctor.
Yeah, nephrology, like a lot of medicine, and nephrology in particular, is a very data-driven specialty. We deal with numbers and formulae and, that kind of stuff. And I know some docs don't like it when family bring a lot of stuff in and the room is filled with stuff that, little things that matter to the patient. But I found that over the years, that's actually really helpful to me. Because you're right, it's very hard to empathize or form a connection with someone where you literally don't know a single thing about their personality or who they were before this happened, or, that kind of stuff. And when patients' families have photographs up, and I always look at them, I always make it a point to look at them. And, sometimes I'll ask about them when the family's there. And it's little things like that help put things in context and help you get a better sense of the patient overall. And, sometimes docs will be like, well, I have such limited time. What's the clinical utility in that? I think there's always utility in forming up some sort of connection with your patient. I think there's always utility in that because especially with critical care, one of the things we deal with is end of life, right? And one of the things we deal with is advanced directives and what would people want. And, when you talk to family about it and you talk to them, sometimes family have trouble, or anyone, not just family, clinicians have trouble, with patients who are in critical condition. How do you try and figure out where to go? And how do you have that conversation? And I think having that human context is a great way to start that conversation. And then the family also feels like you care,
Yeah.
They feel like you're a doc who's not just coming in, checking the numbers, checking for edema, taking a few listens, giving a brief update and leaving. If you take the time they feel like, hey, he's trying to get to know my family member. He obviously cares about him. And, I think only good things can come of that. I just don't see a negative.
I would argue that you're probably saving time in discussions like that by learning a little something and really understanding who this person was. And, one thing we talk about in the field of patient satisfaction is, ultimately everybody dies and nobody's going to be satisfied with that outcome, right? So it's not about leaving the hospital happy. It's not necessarily being satisfied with the outcome, but being satisfied with the care. And if you've got a team that understands that there's a person here who lived a life of depth and relationships, and you acknowledge that in your speaking to them and your decision making, it's really gonna go a long way towards their satisfaction and towards your own satisfaction, right? Like, I mean, we covered a while ago the difference between empathy and compassion, and it's, empathy is where you're like, oh man, how would I feel if this was my parent in the hospital bed? And, you're kind of taking that burden unnecessarily. Compassion is more like, you're just giving them everything that you can to make their experience better. And I think that's a more fulfilling way to care, right? I would think you go home at the end of each day feeling better about what you did if you have more of those types of interactions.
I agree with you 100%. I mean, no one goes into medicine to make numbers better, right? I think that you're absolutely right. It helps. It's one of my anchor points. I call them anchor points. The things that to me are critical for my passion for medicine. And one of those is compassion. And, that feeling that, you help the human being. There's no substitute for that.
So this is kind of a broad question, but how do you pick your topics? How do you choose? How do you decide what's deserving of your attention?
It's a good question. What's funny is that the book makes it seem like this is a very careful process. The book has stories and different topics grouped together. But the truth is the writing is something that I've done for a very long time. And it started in a diary format. It's a way that I process my day and a way that I process kind of what my thoughts are. It's hard to know where that inspiration really comes from. Usually, obviously in my stories, I'm not hung up on individual patient details. Obviously that's not what I'm writing about. I'm writing about broader themes. And my first pass editor is always my mom. She's an English teacher, retired English teacher. So she always gets the first pass of the story. And without question, the first thing she always asks me when I'm like, hey, I just wrote a thread, can you just give it the once over? The first thing she always asks me is, what's your golden nugget? What's the point of this? Like, why are you saying this? And that sort of forces me also to go back and look. And sometimes it's clear to me why I'm writing. Sometimes I'm like, there's a story about a food service worker in there. And that to me was very clear that I was going to write about that after I witnessed an interaction where that person was essentially ignored by two clinicians in an elevator. And I realized that I myself don't know anything about their job. I mean, they're just sort of taken for granted. And then I was like, well, what exactly do they do? Like, how much effort does it take to make these meals, 3 times a day in a hospital full of people with all these specific restrictions and all these, and then I realized also that she probably interacts with patients and gets to know patients. And when the person with the food shows up, usually that's a good thing. And she's had all these experiences. And that was an example where an idea came to me that, okay, I'm going to write about food service workers and kind of that. I call the story The Invisible Woman. And, besides just food service workers, it's just everybody, right? In healthcare, we tend to distill healthcare down into physician-patient or physician-nurse-patient or, whatever. But the point is that it's a vast network of professionals, right? There are a lot of people, and a lot of them are invisible. And not because they're not there or they're choosing to be there. It's just because their roles are just sort of glossed over sometimes. And that's where that story came from. The red car story came from a very specific moment, when I was driving into work and I saw a very dusty car. And the thought occurred to me that I've seen this car here for like 3 weeks now. And then I was like, oh, so a car in a hospital parking lot that's parked there for a long time usually means something. And so then a lot of times when inspiration strikes, I have a little notes folder in my phone and I'll just literally write down a few words. So I just literally wrote down dusty red car. And that's where, that story came from. So different for different things. Sometimes it's something very specific, and other times it's not. Other times I'm not sure what the golden nugget is. I just write a vignette or a sketch or something. And maybe there's meaning there, maybe there's not, but for whatever reason, those words wanted to come out and come together, and I just channeled it, and that was it. And that drives, sometimes my mom will ask me that question, what's a golden nugget? I'm like, I don't know, you figure it out.
Leave me alone.
Yeah, exactly, Mom. Can you just tell me if the grammar is okay?
And no, I didn't clean my room yet.
Yeah. She loves doing it, I think. I should probably say, maybe she hates doing it. She doesn't tell me. She's like, she's like, he's bothering me.
Another tweet. Can you just please get off the Twitter feed?
Just write regular books.
Well, amazing. So if you want to cry on the toilet or in your car, listening on Audible like I am, or I can't recommend Dr. Tabatabai's writing more. It's really, I mean, I'm honored that he would come on the podcast because I've been a fan for so long and his writing's been so cathartic for all of us. So please go out and get it. These Vital Signs, a doctor's notes on life and loss in tweets, and follow him on Twitter at @TheRealDrT. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I didn't realize that time flew by so quickly. I thought we were just getting started. This was a great time, and I really appreciate the shout out. Today is exactly the 1-year anniversary of the book coming out. So this is my media tour for 1-year anniversary. So thanks so much for having me, and I really had a great time.
Doctors dedicate our lives to caring for others. It's time someone took care of us. Visit patternlife.com to simplify your path to peace of mind. Patternlife.com, simplifying your insurance journey. Thanks for listening. I have a favor to ask. You listened to the episode until the end, which means you either fell asleep or you really liked the episode. So please share it, or like it, or comment on a social media post, or write us a 5-star review. Something. It would really help me out. And maybe what you learned from this episode can help someone else too. The views expressed in this episode are those of the interviewer and interviewee and don't represent the views of their employer or even their significant other. Even though the magic of podcasting make it sound like I'm talking directly to you. This is not a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not medical advice or financial advice or really any advice. Thank us again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.